Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone joining us from all over the world. Thank you for joining the webinar hosted by Shah and Leonard. I'm pleased to be here with so many of you. My name is Emily Tan. I'm the General Manager for Shell City Solutions, and I'll be the host and moderator of today's session. First, let me touch on safety, which is one of the core values of Shell. In these unprecedented times, it is even more important for us to focus on safety and health. I hope you're all in a safe location and you've taken the right precautions to remain safe. I'm based here in Singapore, where the situation is quite under control, but I recognize that many of us around the world are still working from home. But I'm glad that we can do this webinar virtually to bring the relevant stakeholders together and jointly discuss the different scenarios and the role of cities in energy transition. Today's webinar covers the 3 scenarios that were drawn for the city of Paris, but the approach and ways of working should be applicable for many cities, and we hope that these scenarios and today's insights will trigger your thoughts and planning, future planning for cities. Before I dive into the content, I would like to make this an interactive session. If we can go to the next slide, I would like to do a very short survey of only 2 questions, which you can answer through Mentimeter. This is a tool that enables us to be interactive. You can use a phone, but you should also be able to do it on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you prefer, you can also open another web page and go to worldwideweb.menti.com and enter the code 3993069. So I'd like to start with 2 questions at the start. How much of the world's emission do cities account for today? I see many of you have already started entering the answers. That's good. Let's give it a few more seconds while people enter your answers. Is it 50%, 70%, or 90% in your opinion? Okay, we seem to have the answers coming in, and most of you answered 70%, and that is the correct answer. So we have a very knowledgeable crowd here today, which is excellent. Let's go on to the next question. So what percentage of the world's population is expected to live in cities by 2050? Is it 3 out of 10, 5 out of 10, 7 out of 10, or 9 out of 10? So the majority of you answered 7 out of 10. Indeed, the UN forecast is 7 out of 10 of us will be living in cities by 2050. So I hope these make the case for why cities are important and the focus of our session today. So let's have a look at the agenda to see what today's program is like. Can we go to the agenda slide? I will kick off with a short introduction on Shell City Solutions and why cities are so important to thrive in the energy transition. And I'm pleased to say that we have Isabel Lambert from Leonard in today's webinar for introduction from her end. Then you'll hear from my colleague Jeremy Bantam, who is heading Shell Scenarios Department, and who will cover how COVID impacts the world and cities and what are the implications for energy and energy transition. Then I'll hand over to Malika Ishwaran, a senior economist from Shell, who will talk you through the 3 different scenarios for Paris and the key insights. Then we will have time for Q&A at the end, where you can ask questions to any of today's presenters. You can submit your questions through the webinar at menti.com using the code 3993069. You can also enter it on the right-hand side of your screen. Okay, with that, let me start off. If we can go to the next slide, let me give a quick introduction of Shell City Solutions and what we do. Next slide, please. So Shell is aiming to become a net zero emission energy business by 2050 or sooner. We intend to meet our customers' demand for cleaner energy, keeping in pace with society. Our new energies business, where City Solutions sits, is actively taking part in delivering Shell's purpose to deliver more and cleaner energy solutions, from renewables to hydrogen and e-mobility, all driven by a customer's approach where we play our part as the energy provider, energy user, or as a partner for change. As I head up the City Solutions department from Shell, I'd like to give you some background on why cities play such an important role. In the Menti questions, you all had the facts correct. So UN forecast that 7 out of 10 of us will live in cities, and cities already contribute to the large majority of today's emission. So as the world continues to urbanize, the way in which city populations produce and use energy must shift to meet global development and climate goals. As Shell, we want to help cities navigate energy transition through integrated urban solutions. The starting point is always what the city needs. We invite city stakeholders such as government, private sector, and the community to join us in co-visioning workshops and work on scenarios to identify a joint pathway towards a lower carbon future. We've worked with numerous cities, but Paris was one where we joined up with the OECD and Leonard Group and 45 relevant stakeholders for the city of Paris in order to fully understand the needs and potential. And that's how we develop these scenarios that we present to you today. Collaboration is really key in getting cities to go towards energy transition, and that's why we want to be a glue to bring together various stakeholders from different parts of government, private sector, and the community. So that's a quick introduction of Shell City Solutions. Now I'm very pleased to introduce Isabel Lambert from Leonard, with whom we've collaborated for these specific scenarios. Over to you, Isabel, for a quick introduction.
Thanks a lot. I'm really delighted to attend this meeting with you today. I'm Isabelle Lambert and I'm part of the Vinci Group. Its mission is to design, finance, build and manage infrastructure and equipment that contribute to improving the daily life and mobility of everyone. Vinci is a big company with 200,000 people dedicated to the construction works in energy, buildings, roads, and concessions as airports, highways, railways, and stadiums. This group has launched in 2017 Leonard, which is the innovation and foresight platform for Vinci Group. Our mission is to detect trends, support innovation, and bring together all the players in the future of cities and territories. For my part, I'm in charge of coordinating the foresight approach. We are working on themes with high stakes for cities and infrastructures in the coming years, such as mobility, new form of work, or environmental issues. Shell proposes to get on board and co-lead the development of these scenarios. The topic is completely corresponding to our current challenges, and in particular of our group who wants to be zero carbon in 2040. We are convinced of the collective intelligence and the enrichment it brings. We were particularly attracted by the idea to compose a group of very large expertise, allowing to cross very different point of view in a common goal that concerns all of us, which is to be zero carbon in 2040. Paris and his area are an incredible play of game. The results produced with their very strong methodology far exceeded our expectations. Our desire now is to maintain this community and this dynamic by duplicating this operation in other cities and transforming together these scenarios into operational projects to work towards a Paris carbon free. Thanks.
Thank you, Isabel. I would now like to introduce my colleague, Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy has been in energy business for more than 35 years. Since 2006, he has been responsible for Shell's global business environment team, which is best known for developing forward-looking scenarios to support strategic thinking and direction setting. Jeremy will now introduce you to Shell scenario thinking. Over to you, Jeremy.
Thanks very much, Emily. It's great to be able to talk to everybody. I do get to talk a lot about the future. And so before we go on, I have to warn everybody that, of course, there are uncertainties ahead when you're dealing with the future. And yet the future is neither random nor is it predictable. You can explore it, and people explore it and deal with the future in different ways. So, for example, lawyers might well deal with the future in the following way. So Hanny, if you can click on to the lawyer's approach to dealing with the future. And so I have to show this slide just in case you misinterpret anything that I am saying or we are saying, and as a result of that, lose your pension or invest inappropriately. But of course, this is only one way of thinking about the future. But the more significant way strategically that we think about the future is through scenarios. So if we can move on to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about why we use scenarios. And basically, it's to help with our decision making. We want to make wiser choices. We recognize that any organization, any individual is limited in their experience and what they see. And yet, there is greater richness and uncertainty around. And so forecasts and sensitivities tend to lock you into previous trends or previous ways of thinking. But we need to stretch that way of thinking, recognizing that the world may be different. It may be different for some technical reasons, but often it is different because of the patterns that people have in making choices. That depends on their histories, their view of the world, how they interpret things. So we need to draw that pluralistic view together in order to get a better understanding of the full landscape of possibility in the future and to prepare for that landscape. So we think about choices that others make, and that affects the choices that we make. I'm going to give you an example in the next slide of work we have been doing to help us think through what the next decade might look like, given the multiple crises of pandemic and economic recession that we're currently going through. And in this, we recognize that people kind of want everything. They want to have a recovery in their economic strength, in their wealth. They want to have security. They want to have public health. And yet, there are going to be trade-offs in this because there's limited bandwidth for people. There is limited resources available. But if we take these tensions and say, what do you emphasize in your priorities, you begin to see different pathways. And we've looked at that over the next 10 years. And we can find that, if you're interested, elsewhere on the web, because we've published those outlooks. But also, next year, we will publish the extension of those beyond and the implications for energy and transitions. But for example, in the Wealth First outlook, what people perceive as bringing resilience is economic strength. The sentiment is, we want things to be the way they were. In the Security First outlook, resilience is perceived as autonomy, and the sentiment is, we want self-sufficiency. And in the Health First outlook, resilience is seen as strengthening those weaknesses that have been exposed by the current crises. The sentiment is, we want to build back stronger. And these lead to different outlooks. So we move to the next slide. I'll just give an example of what we are learning as an energy company from this. We see that these are all challenging worlds, and yet there is the opportunity for both greater economic and social well-being. Energy remains vital. We need energy to do, operate, move things, but there will be lower growth in energy. There will still be decarbonization, but the pace varies significantly between these different outlooks. And yet, by unfreezing mindsets and opening new opportunities for choice, we do see the potential for progress towards the Paris Agreement on climate. And so I hope this has been a valuable example of this way of thinking. And you will see some of these themes returning when we talk about Paris City, having mentioned the Paris Agreement. So at this point, I'd now like to hand back to Emily to take you on further. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jeremy. Who would have thought about a year ago that the COVID-19 pandemic would plunge the world into an unprecedented crisis? Rethinking the 2020 scenarios provide us with food for thought as we plan for the future. If you have any questions, please raise them through the Menti and we'll cover them at the end of the Q&A session. So similarly, we work with the stakeholders of Paris to examine the possible impact of COVID-19 in Paris achieving climate goals. Now I would like to introduce Malika Ishwaran, who will take you through the various scenarios. Malika also works within the scenarios team in group strategy at Shell, focusing on policy and regulatory developments affecting the energy system. She has over 20 years of experience working as an economist and policymaker in the public and private sector, as well as academia. Her role at Shell involves advising on energy and climate change policies that inform Shell's long-term scenario outlooks. Over to you, Malika.
Great, thanks a lot, Emily. If we could move to the next slide, please. So a little bit of context to this work and to why we chose and worked with Paris in terms of our scenario work. In 2018, the city of Paris announced its ambition to become carbon neutral by 2050. So this climate action plan was released in 2018, and what it sort of highlighted was the need for system-wide change within the city in order to achieve those levels of decarbonization. It required changes in how energy is supplied into the city. So the climate action plan commits the city to having 100% renewable electricity by 2050. But that's only one half of the story. There also needs to be change in how energy is consumed and what energy is consumed in the demand sectors, such as in buildings, for transport, for industry. So it needs a system-wide change of both demand and supply in order to make progress in this transition. The other aspect that came out of this is that while the city of Paris has this carbon neutrality target, a lot of the activities that happen around in the larger Paris Metropole region become quite significant in the city achieving this target, primarily because a lot of the supply chains supplying goods and services into Paris extend beyond the city boundaries. Also, people live and work and play in different parts of the region around Paris. And so again, that, changing the supply and demand of energy is important even in that wider region. So again, that's the reason why we looked at the Paris Metropole rather than just the city of Paris. The other sort of, we can talk about sort of the technical issues around changing the energy system in Paris, but also it's important to acknowledge sort of the socioeconomic aspects of making this transition. Energy is fundamentally an individual choice. It enables activities that we do as an individual. And so making the transition requires taking along people so that they make choices that are lower carbon. Now, in doing that, you have to address the socioeconomic context that the city of Paris finds itself in, particularly around the levels of inequality that you see across the Paris Metropole region. This affects the ability of different parts of the metropole to take action to reduce emissions, and also it affects the resilience of these different regions to climate impacts that we see coming through over the course of the next few decades. As Emily pointed out, when we started this exercise, we held a workshop with the sort of local stakeholders in the Paris and city of Paris and the metropole region, covering sort of policymakers across from the mayor's office, from the regional governments and authorities, as well as the federal government. We also brought in sort of stakeholders from the business players active in the city. And then we also had input from academics and from civil society organizations to help us get a full perspective of the local circumstances within Paris. And we used the input from all of that to then fashion the scenarios that I'm going to talk about. So if you can move to the next slide, please. So the three scenarios that we developed as a result of our discussions and analysis and thinking are called Green Tech, the Blame Game, and Paving the Way. I'll briefly go through each of those scenarios, but before I do that, it's sort of worth highlighting a couple of commonalities across these scenarios that we worked and that emerged as we were doing these, producing them. The first is that the two critical uncertainties that cut across all three scenarios. The first one is around inequality and how existing inequality across the Paris region is dealt with. And the way it's dealt with affects the pace and nature of the energy transition that the city then sees. The second sort of critical uncertainty, which is common across a lot of cities that we see, is around governance. Having fragmented, at the same time overlapping responsibilities in terms of policy and governance, also and how that's dealt with, also has a big impact on how and the pace at which Paris makes progress in the energy transition. The third sort of factor which sort of plays through these three scenarios is that the global driving force, the effects of climate change, are inevitable. You see that playing through each of the different scenarios. And again, the response to that sort of defines the nature of the transition that the city then takes. So given these commonalities, what these scenarios do is explore different sort of social, economic, political, and technology choices to deal with these critical uncertainties and the inevitable climate impacts. And that creates, and those different choices lead to these three quite different scenarios that I'm going to talk about. So if we go to the next slide, please. So the first scenario is the green tech evolution. Now in this, you heard Jeremy talk about COVID and the response and the recovery from the COVID pandemic. Now, the COVID has had quite a strong impact in terms of social norms and how we interact both at work and play with each other. In this scenario, it's assumed that the change in these norms has a lasting impact, and that it changes our relationship with technology and with digital services. So this is a scenario where Paris sees this as an opportunity. It uses its sort of base in R&D and capabilities in research and development, as well as its pool of highly skilled white-collar workers to leverage that into producing digital services and technological solutions to navigate the post-COVID sort of environment. This is also seen by government as an area of growth. And so the recovery post-pandemic focuses and puts resources towards this particular sector in developing and enhancing it. So you see the growth of this, Paris becomes an innovation hub. It becomes a sort of a startup hub for Europe and for the wider world. So you see that sort of pattern emerging through the 2020s. In 2030, what we see is a vibrant, the economy has recovered. There's a lot of digital solutions, there's a lot of innovation and activity. But at the same time, what has happened is the gap between digital haves and have-nots has widened. And this has sort of added on to the already sort of inequality that exists in the Paris metropole region. And so you've seen a widening of the inequality over the course of the 2020s. Now, in the 2030s, some of this digital innovation is focused on finding green solutions and sort of turn towards addressing the issue of climate change. So you see some of those applications providing and developing solutions for people to make low carbon choices and live low carbon lifestyles. But at the same time, you see climate impacts also starting to become increasingly evident. So these are sort of extreme weather events like floods and heat waves. So the intensity and the frequency of these in the 2030s becomes more obvious. And again, what that highlights is the inequality. These impacts are felt disproportionately by sort of the more vulnerable and poorer parts of the Paris metropole. And again, this is a bit of a wake-up call in the 2030s. And there is a desire to use the prosperity and the gains that have been made in the last decade or two to apply it towards a more equitable and fair outcome from the energy transition. So what we see when in 2030 is this emerging sort of consensus to have a more inclusive and have a more fair energy transition. And this conclusion and emergence, this journey puts Paris in a very good place to be able to then achieve its goals to be carbon neutral by 2050. So that's the green tech scenario. If we move to the next slide. The next scenario we constructed is called the blame game. So this is a much more turbulent scenario. In this scenario, we assume that the impact of COVID and the pandemic continues and lingers for many years past into the 2020. So this is so economic growth, it starts up in fits and starts, it's not consistent. There is social unrest because the impact of COVID, both in terms of health outcomes, as well as in terms of economic cost of dealing with the pandemic, again, fall disproportionately on the more vulnerable and the poorer in this region. So again, this is a scenario where there's a lot more angst, there's a lot more protest, there's a lot more social unrest in response to in the 2020s as Paris sort of navigates its way through past the pandemic. Now, in this scenario, the government is very much focused on the short term. The near-term sort of urgency of dealing with economic and social problems, it takes precedence. Getting the economy restarted is a priority rather than focusing on the energy transition. And so what it results is in a lot of is sort of government support to entrench existing patterns of consumption and production. Existing industries are supported. And so when we get to 2030, the economy is sort of bumping along. There is dissatisfaction with the outcomes, economic and social outcomes that people are seeing around them. And as a result of that, it starts to be increasing polarization within the different governments and mayors of the Paris region. So the increasing distrust that you see building up of government and the ability of government to solve public problems leads to much different sort of outcomes. Some governments in the Paris region choose to hunker down, choose to double down and say they're going to continue to support and deal with the short-term problems. The other extent of the polarization is in the more wealthy parts, such as the city of Paris. A declaration of climate emergency is done, and more radical solutions are brought to the table as a way of addressing the unrest and the sort of desire from the citizens for their government to deliver better outcomes for them. So you have a sort of a great sort of increasing sort of range of activity and focus in this blame game across the Paris Metropole region. In some areas, climate change is a priority and is really sort of doubled down on and focused on. Despite these governments in these regions being sort of financially and fiscally strained because of the decade of sort of low growth of dealing with the pandemic, they still choose to invest a large amount of money, raise taxes in some ways to invest that money in the infrastructure, in the radical technical solutions that are needed for the city of Paris to decarbonize. In this context, companies and private enterprise is co-opted into the effort to be a sort of a corporate citizen and a responsible citizen. And so you have a lot of investment by the private sector to complement the public sector to drive this change towards decarbonization. But what you see while you have that happening in the 2030s, you have a lot of upheaval and turbulence. But at the end of the 2030s, the city of Paris actually is a really pleasant place to live. The changes, infrastructure changes, the changes in modes of travel have all been put in place. And so actually, if you live there, it's quite pleasant. It's a low carbon city, but at the same time, it's a city that only the wealthy can afford to live in. So the regime of high taxes and sort of high provision of public services sort of restricts the people who can afford to live there. So again, there's a realization that in order for Paris to continue to be prosperous in this way, it needs to have the region around it also becoming and joining it and catching up with it. Without that, there is a sense that there will be limits to the extent to which Paris can continue to grow. And with that realization, there's a sense that the city of Paris itself can exemplify for the surrounding regions the kinds of changes that are needed, the best practice in order to decarbonize, and also then share some of its wealth and its economic resource in order to help these less advantaged areas make the transition. We can go to the next slide, which describes a third scenario called paving the way. Now, in this, again, it takes COVID-19 as a starting point. But the fact that COVID-19 has such a disproportionate effect on the poorest and the most vulnerable leads to a period of reflection within the Paris Metropole region on inequality and on fairness. And what this leads to is a great sort of a blooming of community level activism, grassroots activism, where communities take charge and responsibility for the outcomes within their communities to deliver more fair and more what's seen as equitable outcomes to all the people living within that area. So you see a devolution of power and policy making to the local levels, with local mayors and local authorities having a lot more agency in being able to invest and prioritize and drive the changes that matter most to their communities. So in 2030, after a decade of this kind of change, you find communities are sort of resilient, are more equal, and you find but what you do find is that even though local outcomes have improved for each of these communities, a problem like climate change requires coordination across them in order to be effectively addressing it. And that level of coordination doesn't occur. So you're looking at 2030 where it's a very pleasant place to live in your community. You're supported and outcomes are made to be fair and equitable. But at the same time, the links between the communities and alignment on climate hasn't yet occurred. Again, in this scenario, climate impacts start playing in. And again, in the 2030s, and you see those climate impacts affecting the different communities differently, depending on what they've chosen to prioritize over the 2020s, the previous decade. So those communities that have prioritized climate resilience and mitigation fare better, whereas those that haven't are at the sort of front end of the impacts of this climate change. So in this case, again, that's a driver to start sharing and cooperating and coordinating better across the Paris Metropole region to share in the experience, best practice, to drive greater education and engagement with the issue of climate change. And by 2040, you're in a position where the metropole as a whole is making good progress towards achieving its carbon neutrality goal by 2050. In fact, so much so that Paris decides to also become the global leader in decarbonizing sectors such as aviation, which are not just local, but also working with governments across Europe to see how transport might be decarbonized, working with other global cities to make sure that aviation is decarbonized. So again, Paris steps up beyond its local environment and its local concerns to become a global leader in how to drive decarbonization. So if you go to the next slide. So I hope the scenario so far sort of given a flavor of the range of different changes and the range of different political, socioeconomic, technology solutions that play across and interact with each other over the course of the next 3 decades. Now, while they are different, there are some commonalities that emerged from each of these 3 scenarios in order to make progress. So we looked at each of these scenarios and said, what are the elements that feature in each of them that help make progress towards carbon neutrality? And the 4 here, which I'll briefly touch on, firstly, the importance of alignment of governance at all levels. So alignment of city, regional, federal governments around the issue of climate change in terms of financing, technology development, infrastructure is absolutely crucial in order to get the pace of change you need. A just transition also came across in all the 3 scenarios as a key driver the more people feel engaged in the transition, the less likely they are to put up barriers and slow down the transition. In addition to that, I mean, the energy transition in Paris provides an opportunity to actually drive a more inclusive growth path and a more inclusive growth model, which allows, addresses this historic inequality that you see across the region. The third sort of factor that came across quite clearly was that not every part of Paris would move, the region of Paris Metropole would move at the same pace. For different reasons, in different scenarios, you had some sections of the metropole moving faster than others. I mean, that's okay. And I think making progress where it's possible is a good way to do it. And also the making progress, the first moving regions are exemplars for other parts of the metropole to follow. And they're also, have the resources and the ability, once they've made that change, to support other parts of Paris into making the same changes. And finally, that the progress in energy transitions is not within the gift of any one group. It's cannot just be done by governments, can't just be driven by consumers or citizens. And it's not necessarily the only something that businesses can do on their own. So you need this sort of virtuous cycle of governments, businesses, and consumers all acting together and pulling in the same direction. And that's what then gives you the progress that's needed in the time, relatively short time that's needed to make this change. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to hand back to Emily. I hope this has sparked a bunch of questions, and I look forward to a good Q&A.
Thanks, Malika. A very clear and insightful overview of the three scenarios. I can imagine this was quite a lot to take in. So for the audience, please note that we have a website and brochure there. We can find more details. You can find this at shell.com/Paris sketch in one word. This link was also provided in your invitations. Now we hope to address most of the questions. If we go to the next slide, for those of you who haven't logged on to Menti, please do so and enter your questions or upvote the questions that you prefer to be answered first. Code is 3993069. The Menti questions are anonymous, so if you would like to not make it anonymous, please do also state your name and company so that we can help to address that. Okay, so you can also enter your questions on the right-hand side of the screen. Let's now look at the first question. Let me just pull up the Menti questions myself. Okay, are these scenarios valid for Paris only? Malika, do you want to answer that?
So yes, I think one of the things we worked across a number of cities, and one of the things that does stand out is that the circumstances in individual cities are quite unique, and that will determine the nature of the transition, the kinds of choices that governments or people are willing to make in order to achieve the goal. So in some sense, I think these scenarios are very much Paris, they're very much based on the drivers and the circumstances of Paris. I think the approach itself is something that's very well suited to cities, because I think the approach allows this customization, the flexibility to understand, and it builds off the understanding of what is the conditions in those cities. So I think I would say these scenarios themselves are very much Paris related, but again, this approach can be applied, sort of similarly to other cities to get insightful scenarios and understanding of what's going to drive change and what are going to be the barriers to change in different cities. I'm saying that, but I know that Jeremy has worked in this area for much longer than me. So I don't know if you want to add something to that, Jeremy.
Thanks very much. Now, indeed, one of the things that we've learned is that the way cities are even organized is pretty unique. And so, the approach of bringing people together and really exploring things together is something that you can apply. But equally, there are similarities. And so from work that I may talk about another opportunity with another question that we've done in the past, we work with 3 or 4 very different cities and found that some of the types of energy solutions that would contribute to their resilience were similar. So there are lessons to learn to be able to apply in other cities.
Thank you, Jeremy. Let me go on to the next question. Is the City of Paris able to reach the 2050 target purely based on local decarbonization, or will they have to rely on carbon offsets purchased in other parts of France or across the world? Who would like to answer that? Do you want to try that, Malika?
Yeah, sure. So again, it explored, how the pathways to get, how, Paris could get there. So rather than coming up with the specific solutions, you're sort of exploring the drivers of what people are willing to do to achieve that goal. I mean, a lot of, I think one of the reasons we extended the city of Paris to look at the entire metropole was because of the linkages. Just reducing emissions within the city limits is not sort of feasible, and it doesn't make sense given sort of the connections that you have to the wider metropole region. Now, I think, in this, the other thing that stood out is that you have to have national coordination also to do this. So I think, the Paris has a lot of levers within its own control, but also needs to work within the context of sort of the national and regional objectives and priorities. And I think within that, I mean, we touched on paving the way, that you then have to work within the European context to reduce some of the emissions from the more difficult and international sectors like aviation. So I think there's a lot of connections and layers that you need to add up in order for Paris to be completely decarbonized. Now, we didn't look specifically at offsets. I mean, there is some potential for reducing emissions in the metropole through better sort of agricultural practices, through better, sort of making the most of the green space and creating those green space. But it wasn't really done. That was a way of actually driving greater engagement with the citizens in this agenda, rather than as a way of, sort of balancing out the emissions that continue to remain in the region. So I think it's part of the solution, but it was very much part of the solution within the whole Paris metropole region, rather than them going and buying some from I don't know, global markets as a way of offsetting their emissions. So I hope that helps give a little bit of what these scenarios show up, and also the kinds of role that these nature-based offsets could have in these scenarios. So overall, Paris doesn't need to buy offsets in order to meet these goals. It's well placed in each of the scenarios to make progress and to achieve it. But within the context of the metropole region, there is a role for greener practices and sort of green spaces and better agricultural practices to reduce emissions.
Thank you, Malika. The next question I have is, what have Charles and Vinci learned from the Paris scenarios that will affect your business? Can I ask Isabel to take that question first for Vinci Group?
Yeah, thanks a lot. Really, really good question. These scenarios were very interesting and confirm us that we all are actors to make the change, and the position of the big group as us are very determinant, are playing a determinant game in the solution that we can propose and that are active to decrease the carbon effect. So this is the first point. And the second one is that a systemic approach that we can have, so that increase the needs to collaborate and to build a collaborative solution. We can't act alone. If we want to make the thing happen, we have to increase the partnership with other groups, as we are initiating now with Shell to act in favor of the decreasing of zero carbon. And the third one is the inequality. So we had this in mind, and in particular in the foresight we are doing, we are considering a lot this question of inequality, but these scenarios raised this point and reinforced this point. So we will definitely take into consideration this point too, and ensure that our solution can take this into account.
Thank you, Isabel. I think from Charles' point of view, indeed, I will echo Isabel's statement about collaboration is key. Having the different stakeholders come to the table in the scenarios workshop and understanding what were their their key needs and their focus areas really help us to understand that collaboration from various stakeholders is absolutely key. As we look at solutions to enable lower carbon, we really need to look at holistic solutions, and there needs to be innovation not only in technology, but also in business models that can enable such solutions to be replicated and sized up. Jeremy, do you have anything else to add?
No, I think you covered it well. So I'll just leave the time for the next question. What I would say is that this work is emphasizing the importance of a user-centric business perspective. So being able to think back from the way that any service or product is being used towards what it is that you deliver as a business, rather than thinking from the supply forwards.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Thanks for that, Jeremy. The next question, are other cities shortlisted for this approach as well, or was this a one-off? I'll ask Jeremy to answer first and I'll add on.
Yeah, thank you. Indeed, our work with municipalities and engaging with urban development goes back several years. And if you're interested, you can go on our website to download a publication that we produced with the Centre for Livable Cities in Singapore about scenarios for urban development. And from that, we worked with several cities. I remember working closely with municipalities in Marikina City, part of the larger Manila metropolitan area. And there, the authorities and ourselves published that material. So that is available. Similarly, with the Indian city of Surat, working with Jakarta, that I don't think that's been published, but also I know that there's been work that has been done with this type of approach with Chennai and Perth, and I'm probably forgetting some as well. So it's spreading across the world, and we are learning a lot from that. Perhaps Emily can talk about more recent ideas, but I'm just giving you that kind of view from the experience from several years ago to now.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. To add on to that, this is certainly not once off. We do intend to work with more cities on their pathways towards a lower carbon future. City Solutions is working with various cities, and we partner cities that are committed to going towards a lower carbon future, and also where Shell has presence that we can significantly add value to those cities. So watch the space. We will have more city scenarios coming up in the future. Next question I have is, how much hard data has been driving the scenarios, or is this more of a thought piece? I'll ask Malika to take that question.
Yes, good question. Because I think the art of the scenarios is taking the hard data, but then fashioning it into narratives and future views of how these changes could evolve. So in the case of Paris, I think we had a lot of hard data to understand the various elements of Paris today. So it was around the inequality, the state of infrastructure, sort of the economic conditions in terms of growth and labor force. So we used a lot of data to understand what Paris looks like today. Then we used that data to analyze what we thought the evolution of Paris would look like under different political, technology, or economic drivers. So and that goes into a little bit of the art where you have to use robust thinking to make sure your scenarios are internally consistent with where you're starting today, and also in terms of how the various elements of the city evolve in the future. And so I think it's a blending of, very much data driven and to understand today, very analytically driven to make sure things are internally consistent when we construct these scenarios. But at the end of the day, we would like to tell a story and to bring to life the journey that a city takes, because these are huge challenges that we're undertaking. And the first is not to sort of focus in on the challenge aspect and the elements that need to change, but it's about creating that vision and that story and that inspiration to then sort of take the next step in actually making some of these changes.
Thanks, Malika. The next question, I have two questions that are similar, so I'll group them together. So what are the tangible next steps? Would the city of Paris do anything with these scenarios? And then I have another question which asks, what is the response of the municipalities of Paris on these scenarios? Can I ask Isabel to respond first?
Yeah, concerning the next step we are working on, I will let Alexis, which are working on this with this topic, to complete. But we definitely want to continue the discussion, and we are now approaching the Mairie of Paris to discuss with them and see how can we work together on this project based on this scenario that we already have presented to them. So we will try to see if we can consult different companies to work on this project together. So Alexis, if you want to complete the question.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Isabel. And so first of all, we're going to have also next week on the 18th another webcast, this time for French speakers only, where we're going to engage also the local stakeholders, including the City of Paris and also other public authorities. We have already approached the City of Paris and presented them the first gist of the scenarios, and they were happy with that. Also to notice that they were part, I mean, some representative of the City of Paris were part of the expert group that we formed in September to build the scenarios. So they were fully part of that journey from the beginning. And in terms of tangible actions, yeah, so that's something that we need now to work on with them, to form this kind of, to form a group of other companies, of NGOs, and together with the public sector to create this kind of collective intelligence, to put on the table tangible solutions.
Thanks for that. Next question we have is, does Paris have data on its GHG emissions in 2015, 2016, 2019, and interim targets for GHG emissions in the future until 2050? Malika, do you want to take that?
So they do report their emissions. Whether it's how consistent across sectors, I'm not sure, but they do report their emissions. That's what's the basis of the climate action plan for 2050. They have interim targets for 2030 across the range of decarbonizing electricity to how to change transport and electricity used in buildings. So they do have interim targets in 2030 as part of the climate action plan.
Thanks for that. Next question we have is, isn't there a trade-off between some parts of the city moving forward and a fair transition for all cities of Paris Metropole? Think of congestion pricing and effects on those outside of Paris. I think I'll ask Malika to answer that as well.
Yes, and I'll bring in Alexis, as he's on the ground there, and Isabel to add to it. I think one of the things that really stood out is the different pace of change for many different reasons, and some of it is sort of accentuating the inequalities across the region. But there are limits to how much change you can do in communities or in different cities within the region. At some point, the linkages become the limit of how much action you can take on your own. And that's what we see driving in each of the scenarios for the climate action and the energy transition to open up beyond being purely local. And I like the idea of the congestion charging, and transport is one of those areas where people commuting in, freight coming in and out of the city, this is all going to affect the emissions of the city of Paris. So just thinking about it in a narrow sense around the boundaries doesn't make sense. You can make progress up to a point by focusing on that, because it focuses action and it drives it. But at some point, it has to broaden out beyond that particular geographical boundary. And that's what we find in each of the three scenarios. So I don't know, Alexis, if you want, or Isabel, you want to add to that?
Maybe let me add a few elements, and also realize that I didn't introduce myself, by the way. I'm the energy transition manager for Shell in France, and I'm focusing on several tangible projects on e-mobility and hydrogen, for example. some people in the audience may remember that in France we had a lot of protests about 2 years ago now, named the yellow jackets, and everything started from a carbon tax on diesel. And so you can see that if you don't manage well the acceptance of those new policies, then you cannot really pursue them, and then you have really a real blocker from the population. So finding the right trade-off between those measures and fairness is indeed a state of art, but it's absolutely essential. Otherwise, you won't be able to go through it.
Thank you, Alexi. Isabel, do you have anything to add?
The answer was complete, so nothing to add. Very good example he took, so that's perfect.
Thanks, Isabel. Next question we have is, it was mentioned that the effects of climate change are inevitable, but if we accelerate decarbonization, can't we significantly reduce those impacts? Can I ask Jeremy to take this question?
Thank you very much. And obviously that's a global question with very local consequences as well. And so some people may be familiar with our publication a couple of years ago of the sky scenario, which was a view on the technical, industrially, and economically plausible pathway towards achieving the aspirations of the climate agreement, Paris Climate Agreement. And in one sense, if you look at the outlooks on the 20 that I mentioned, the health first outlook actually is following the first 10 years towards being on that kind of pathway when that's extended. And so when we extend that, we're referring that to Sky 1.5, i.e. the 1.5 degrees stretched target of the Paris Agreement. So that is possible, but other choices might be made. So if you're making the kinds of choices in society that would lead towards the wealth first type of pathway or the security first type of pathway, you will decarbonize, but you will decarbonize at a slower rate. And so the impact eventually will be greater. But we mustn't forget that it's the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that has the impact. And the industrial emissions that we've had for decades and longer now are in the atmosphere and have locked in certain changes that are inevitable in all scenarios over the next 10 to 20 years. But we do have the possibility of making choices that can mitigate the extension of that beyond those periods. And the fact of the kind of crisis that we're currently having is potentially a trigger for making some of those choices. And so I think in one sense, the ability to achieve the Paris ambitions is paradoxically improved by having this trigger point now for choices.
Thanks, Jeremy, for that. We only have time for one last question, and the outstanding question we have is, what are the areas that offer the biggest opportunities for emissions reduction in Paris? Since it's the last question, I will request each of the panelists to give your vote for the top area you think has the biggest opportunity for Paris, and to go off mute. Shall we start with Isabel?
Yes, the biggest opportunity, or there is so many, but I think the mobility and transport will be the first action to make.
Thank you. Jeremy?
I agree with Isabel, and I think that it's not just to do with the personal transport, although that's very important, but it's public transport, infrastructure, and actually the way heavy freight connects Paris with the rest of the world. So I think this is about mobility, but there are several aspects to it.
Thanks, Jeremy. Malika?
Yes, I was going to say mobility, but I think that other sector that's sort of the big one that came out is buildings. So Paris has a very sort of old building stock, and a lot of that is not particularly energy efficient. It also has a sort of a higher carbon heating system. So I think to me, there's the biggest opportunity, but that's also probably the more challenging of the sectors.
Thanks for that, Malika. Alexi?
Well, to maybe add something a bit different to what has been said, probably also reforestation of the city, because the city of Paris is very concrete based, and planting trees will definitely help the city to reach that.
Thanks for that. And my input, actually, city of Paris, one of the largest emitters is actually Charles de Gaulle Airport, because Paris is a city, well, was a city where lots of tourists flock to every single year. It's a top tourist destination. As the COVID situation settles and tourism restarts, there is also an urgent need to look at how do we decarbonize people traveling in and out of Paris from the airports, and also how do we decarbonize aviation coming into Paris. So this, we're now at time, so I'd like to close out the webinar. Thanks again to all of you for dialing in and being part of this webinar. And really thanks Isabel as well for being part of this cooperation and part of this webinar. If you have any further questions, do feel free to reach out to myself or any of my colleagues. Again, I would like to emphasize that it is only through collaboration that we can make cities sustainable places to live and work for our children, grandchildren, and many generations to come. We're happy to continue the conversation. So once again, thank you so much and have a nice rest of the day. Thank you. Bye-bye.